Hello, welcome to Handling the Boom in International E-Commerce. I'm Steve Dietzick with Pitney Bowes E-Commerce Solutions. I've been studying and researching and consulting in the international e-commerce space for about 5 years now. And Pitney Bowes is a company that specializes in international e-commerce. And so I've been helping retailers think through their international strategies now for about 5 years. And the title of this session is Handling the Boom in International E-Commerce. And boom is a very, very appropriate word for what's happening right now within the international space. More and more international consumers are accessing U.S. websites at an unprecedented rate. And the question becomes, how can you serve them through integrating new and innovative technologies to increase your conversion on your site? So today we're going to spend a bit of time on talking about what's causing the boom, the opportunity and trends in the space. We'll go through some technologies and best practices, then we'll hand it over to my colleague, Thet, VP of Technology at Guidance Solutions, to have a little bit of a tech talk, then we'll open up a Q&A. So the first slide is pretty obvious. It shouldn't even be up here probably, but it's already on a slide, and by the rules of PowerPoint, I must present it. So trend one, the global online population is absolutely surging. And we all know this, but I just wanted to go through two quick, powerful trends that underpin this. The first is that companies like HP, Dell, Lenovo, those global PC manufacturers, the U.S. market is pretty tapped out. And Apple is destroying them in the U.S. market. And so they see their growth as abroad. They have very strategic priorities in Eastern Europe, Asia Pacific, Latin America. So their objective is to get more and more PCs, laptops, computers in the hands of more and more international consumers. Now couple this with the second trend, where we see global governments moving more and more towards broadband wireless for their populations. We see this specifically in China, specifically in Eastern Europe, and in Latin America. So now people have devices, they have internet, they're online all the time. Trend number two, global e-commerce markets are surging. Now, this is happening because there are payment companies like TSYS in the U.S. that are in the same boat as the global PC manufacturers. TSYS is the largest manufacturer of credit cards in the States. For every one American, there are 5 credit cards. Very saturated market. And so their growth they view also in Asia Pacific, Eastern Europe, and Latin America. And the PayPal folks in the audience can appreciate you've done a lot to increase and facilitate global transactions. And so now we see this perfect storm brewing where people have devices, they have access to online broadband wireless, and they have things to pay with. And so people are accessing U.S. websites at this unprecedented rate. Couple this with the third trend here, where the U.S. dollar maintains a weakened position, and people start talking. You know, they can get products cheaper, and they can comparison shop on U.S. websites compared to their own domestic shops as well, and they may get a better deal on the U.S. websites. So they increasingly come here. And then there's the last trend where there are just U.S. brands and products that they can't get anywhere else besides the U.S. And so these are really all coming together to form this perfect storm and catalyzing cross-border e-commerce. And whenever we use that term cross-border, it refers to international customers accessing U.S.-based websites. So just a context set, in 2009, out of the $135 billion in U.S. B2C e-commerce, 6% was coming from international sources. Well, by 2015, our analysis shows that this is going to almost triple to 15%. So it's this huge looming opportunity of more and more international consumers accessing U.S. websites. So we really need to think through what's it going to take to get them to purchase once they're on my site. How can we make them feel most at home and really facilitate that transaction? So a couple more stats for you before we get into that. The top 10 geographies for U.S. retailers by retail spending. And this kind of has an influence over our technology thought too, because depending on where your strategic markets are, if they're in Canada, you're going to need to implement some very different technologies than you would if they were coming from, say, Australia. But just in terms of the overall volume, we see Canada, Australia, and the UK emerge as the 3 top markets. And this really shouldn't be surprising. These are very English-speaking countries. They know U.S. brands, they know U.S. payment mechanisms, and they know U.S. products. So we see these 3 countries really account for 80% of the total volume going out of the U.S. right now. We also did a body of research with a partner earlier this year that analyzed global power shoppers. Global power shoppers are defined as those spending over $1,000 a year on U.S. websites alone. And 70% of those types of shoppers come from those markets as well. So if you do these 3, not only do you get 80% of the total volume, you get 70% of those customers who are really savvy and who want to shop on U.S. websites. Lastly, top-selling international products. We took all of the harmonized system codes going through our database, and we broke that down into actual product categories. And so we see apparel, footwear, and leather really emerge as what's being most accessed by international consumers. Now, this is not to say that people who are selling computers, electronics, home goods, that there's not an opportunity, because there definitely is. We ship everything from crayons to guitars to cosmetics, but this is only to say that those retailers who are apparel and footwear, the opportunity is ripe. International consumers are looking for these things when they come into US-based websites, and so take advantage of that opportunity. Okay, the main event here, global e-commerce technologies. Now, when we talk about these, we generally break them into 3 different buckets. The first is payment, the second is shipping, the third is localization. So let's just briefly go over each of these. Payment, dynamic currency conversion. The ability to display a customer's home currency from where they're accessing it from. It makes them feel comfortable on the site. The psychology is there that if they see their home currency, they're going to be more likely to buy and convert. Now, there's some subtle nuances with this one, though, and I would urge people to implement a technology where they can toggle in between the US dollar and the home currency, because there's a really interesting psychology behind knowing that the US dollar is weakened and that you get an advantage because you have a more powerful currency. And so we've heard from a lot of different retailers that, hey, we actually like displaying US dollars as opposed to home currencies because they'll end up buying more. And so just having that ability to toggle between the other currency and their US currency is a really best practice that we find. The next one is multi-payments, the ability to allow a customer to pay in whatever payment method they want to pay in. We see this as a major factor in conversion. And we all know the stats. You know, in Germany, there's something called the one-off direct debit that us in the States have no clue what that is. But they pay with it all the time. The same thing exists in the Netherlands as well. And so, but this is tricky, too, because there's a lot of U.S. retailers who are not set up on the back end to handle anything other than U.S. credit cards. And so what we see emerging are some really slick payment technologies that are third parties, then they enable the international customer to pay in whatever payment mechanism they want, and then it goes into this third-party cloud. They process the payment, they handle the back-end financial reconciliation, then their APIs pass back US dollars to that retailer. So the retailer doesn't have to worry about financial reconciliation, hiring more accountants to account for currency and things like that. So I did want to make that note, too, that as a very important advancement in technology in terms of international e-commerce. Lastly, fraud. We all know domestic fraud tools with CyberSource and Count and those types of players. But within international orders, sometimes there are some subtle nuances as well. So it really helps for you to partner up with that third-party fraud provider who knows that, hey, maybe Russia, pretty risky environment. You might need to do some more accounting there. Or in Brazil and Eastern Europe, we find that those are more risky as well. Okay, shipping. The first one here is landed costs. In Canada in particular, we hear this every day. The Canadian customer will buy a U.S. product, let's say for $100, then it reaches their doorstep. They thought they paid for shipping, then they get hit with duty and tax and COD fees at the door. It can be anywhere from $50 up through 100% of the product cost, another $100. That relates in a very negative customer experience. So the best practice here in the landed cost technology, there are APIs and third parties set up to show you that fully landed cost quote right there in the shopping cart. So they pass to you via the API, duty, tax, brokerage, shipping and handling. They pass it to your back end. Your UX developers can display that however they want on the front end. We have a lot of retailers who actually have a flat fee. They say $20 for all international orders. But on the back end, they know the full landed cost, and they can take care of that for the end buyer. We also have retailers that only want to display shipping and handling in one line and then duty and tax in the other line. So the international buyer can clearly see, hey, I'm actually paying duty and tax right here, and I know it. And then, pepper that with some more marketing messaging that says, this order is 100% taken care of. You'll never be taxed beyond that point. The next one is international shipping methods and options. And the key word here is options, because I think we know it's really easy to just embed a FedEx API or a UPS API into our shopping cart and start opening up the doors to international orders. But the key word is options, because we find in the international space that we know FedEx and UPS have a superior service, but it also can cost a lot of money for the international buyer, which can really kill conversion. On the flip side, we see the USPS has a very attractive price point, but oftentimes, it takes 3 to 4 weeks to get there. The tracking's not there. And that's okay for some buyers, and that's the point here. Some people like FedEx and UPS and some of those higher tier options because they want it there in 2 to 4 days and they're willing to pay for it. Others just don't care at all, and they're willing for it to take 4 weeks to get there, and they're willing to pay a very low price point. And then there are a lot of third parties that have emerged that present kind of a mid-tier shipping option. Something that doesn't cost $50, doesn't cost $5, but it costs $10 to $15 to ship, takes 5 to 10 days to get there, a very mid-tier option. And what we've seen in best practice, we've seen dramatic conversion when you're able to present those 3 types of shipping methods. The high quality one, the low quality one, then the mid-tier one. So if anybody wants to talk about that afterwards, I'd be more than willing to share more on that as well, because we really do see that emerging as a key part of conversion. Import and export management. There are 200 different potential markets out there. Each one has its own set of regulations as it pertains to import and export management. Sometimes you won't be able to ship a certain product to a different destination because of that. So how do you meaningfully scale your business and go to those 200 different markets? There are technologies that exist that enable you to scale very gracefully, and they've done the hard work with knowing those 200 sets of logic and 200 sets of regulations. So you can consume that service as well, either via third party or API. Address standardization. This falls in the same bucket as import and export management. Again, there's 200 sets of address formats out there, of postal standards, of postal codes. And how can you make sure that the international buyer is inputting the correct address into the line? There are also technologies out there that can take care of that for you. Lastly, localization and language translation. Now, this has been heavily debated, I think, within the international community, because as US-based retailers, we spend so much money on our copy, developing the right message to the right consumer at the right time, that when you can pass it through some kind of language translator, we lose that brilliance of the copy, we lose that impact. And so some retailers hate displaying their own copy in a different language. Others can partner with a company like MotionPoint or translations.com to actually go through and translate each copy and make it meaningful and impactful on the back end with the other international consumer. But I've seen a best practice emerge with Urban Outfitters too, where they realized that they didn't want to take their powerful copy and translate it, but they realized that the consumer really wanted to know more about payment and shipping, so they just translated what was in their shopping cart. The stuff that was really important to the buyer was how are they going to pay and how is it going to get there being shipped. So they just translated what was in the shopping cart, and they saw a good boost from it. So I've seen that emerge as a pretty powerful practice as well. So I said I'm from Pitney Bowes, and in this space right now, Pitney Bowes is all in. We buy into the opportunity. We heavily believe the underpinnings of these trends, and we believe it's going to be a powerful, powerful catalyst. And then it shouldn't be just 10 to 15% of your business. That international e-commerce should really account for 20, 30, 40, 50% of your total retail business. And so we wanted to know how to facilitate this in the retail community. We kind of asked ourselves, should we invest in shipping? Should we invest in a fraud tool? Should we invest in multi-payments or multi-currency? So we did this body of research just earlier this year. And we polled 1,000 consumers from the UK, 1,000 from Australia, and 1,000 from Canada. And we asked them, what is the main deterrent when you're on a US-based website and you want to convert and you want to buy that product, but you don't? What's the main reason why that's happening? And these are the responses. And we were delightfully surprised to find that shipping was really the main pain point. High shipping costs emerged as the top one. 77% of the respondents said this is the main deterrent. If I see something that's high shipping in the cart, I'm gone. Likewise, additional fees at delivery, those COD fees, 2D and tax we mentioned earlier, that emerged as the second thing. And this isn't to say that credit cards and multi-payments, multi-currency, that's not to say that that stuff's not important. But this was really to get into the head of the international consumer and to ask them what's most important to them. So if you failed on everything else and had a really strong price point for shipping and good quality shipping, it appears as if that would really go a long way with the international consumer. But of course, in an ideal world, you couple shipping with multi-currency and multi-payments and all that. The retailer international continuum. So a lot of people have questions around, when should we start embedding these things within our shopping cart and within our e-commerce platform. So I wanted to paint this picture for everybody. So step one of going international is really just simply accepting global orders. And again, that's not that hard to do. And we've worked with retailers who don't want to go to step two yet. They say, Steve, we just want to see what kind of demand is there. So they build it within their either Magento checkout. They just start accepting to see what kind of foot traffic they get, to see what kind of conversion they get. But really, if you want to take the next step and make the customer feel more at home and start facilitating bigger volume, you need to go to step two. And that's implementing some of this global technology that we've been talking about. Multi-payments, currency, fraud, landed costs, and different shipping methods and address standardization. Step three is really going hardcore, and it's localizing your sites, having a .co.uk for the UK, .ca for Canada, providing in-country shipping with third-party logistics providers to provide that 1 to 2 day transit times at really low costs, and then translating your site as well to really get a localized feel. And then the fourth, of course, is just an in-country presence, where you have brick-and-mortar stores. You really try to blow out that presence in your strategic markets. Now, step 1 to step 2 is actually not incredibly difficult because, again, there are lots of third parties out there. There's lots of APIs that your developers can take and embed within your core platform. And that's not that hard. We've seen it happen where all of those technologies mentioned can be implemented in the time frame of 1 to 2 months, under a month with a truly dedicated set of developers. Step 2 to step 3 is a pretty big undertaking, and that takes a little bit longer. It takes more strategic analysis and ROI to really convince your leadership that this was what needs to happen. And we only really see it with retailers who view a market as so important that they need to do it. If Western Europe is so important to the long-term sustainability of your company, then you should really heavily look into a 3PL for domestic delivery, housing product abroad, and also partnering with language translation providers to provide that localized experience. Okay, now I just wanted to go through some screenshots that I really thought were worthwhile to mention in this setting. So this is probably blatantly obvious to everybody, but I wanted to put it on here. To the UX designers in the room, international signage definitely matters. At Pitney Bowes, we serve about 100 retailers right now. There are some retailers that do 50,000 shipments or more a year internationally, and then there are a lot, frankly, that do less than 1,000. And we kind of wanted to step back and ask ourselves, why is this happening? And of course, the real answer is that there are so many variables. It could be that the ones that are 50,000 plus have these ginormous brands and they really appeal. But a really good consistency we found was that those that had 50,000 plus, they had very welcoming home screens that said that, yes, we accept international orders, we ship to XYZ country. Going the extra mile is actually sensing the geolocation of the customer and then having a flag, because that flag, believe it or not, goes a long way with making them feel more comfortable and accepted on that site. And so, Urban Outfitters, welcome. Please select the region you would like to ship in. This is a very welcoming site to an international customer. The next one is PacSun. Clearly displayed with the flags there. They can tell it's going to be shipped from the U.S., but they definitely know that this company accepts international orders. So I did want to point that out, that signage really matters when you're talking about getting customers to your site and really converting them. The next one is that, again, according to our research, shipping options matter most. And I really liked what ShopBop was doing. They say proud and clear that free worldwide shipping in 3 days or less if it's an order over $100. And so this, first of all, coerces people to spend more than $100 because who doesn't want free shipping? But then if you look at their shipping options, this is just beautiful to me. They have free 1 to 3 day delivery with customs and duties deposit. So you can go ahead and prepay duty and tax if you want. But then if you look a line item down, you don't have to prepay if you don't want to. Because, in the shipping psychology, we find that certain countries, in Canada, they think they're going to get hit every time. So why not just prepay it? And in different Latin American countries and even in Eastern Europe, they want to roll the dice. They want to gamble. They don't always get hit with duty and tax collection when it reaches their door. So it's good to have that option to say, you know what, you don't have to prepay. Have the second option where you can just accept the shipping and do it that way. And then, of course, the last option is a standard option, 7 to 20 days. It's free anyway, so I don't know why anyone in the world would choose that option. But at least it's up there to give the customer more optionality. Okay, multi-payments matter. This is my last screenshot, but just the ability, again, to toggle in between US dollar and the other currency, I think is pretty cool. And here we have Karmaloop. This is in the storefront, so they embedded it within their storefront and within their checkout, so the customer can go back and forth to see what the true cost is to them, what the current exchange rates, and what the US dollar is. So they have that psychology where they say, okay, we're triumphing over the US dollar if we're from the UK, so I actually want to see that in US dollars. Okay, my last slide before I hand it over to my colleague here is that international e-commerce right now is really driven by third-party apps, APIs, and services. This stuff is really tough. There's 200 markets out there, each with its own different sets of logic. You could have its own set of code as well for each market that you're targeting, but there have been a lot of companies out there, especially in the past 5 years, really pioneering multi-payments and what that looks like and how to make it easy, pioneering fraud and multi-payments, pioneering shipping and landed costs. And so take advantage of that. And a lot of that's already embedded with Magento extensions, with plugins into eBay. A lot of companies are doing some cool things out there. And so I wanted to say lastly that it is driven by third-party apps. If I were a developer, connect with the Magento extension, the Magento community, and look at what's out there, do some analysis on how easy the APIs are to integrate, and then come to some fruitful decision making. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Thet, who's going to talk a little bit more to the tech track. Thet?
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, everybody. I wanted to actually go back to this slide first. But before I get into it, I'm with Guidance. My name is Ted Nguyen. Guidance is a full-service commerce implementation consultancy based in Los Angeles, California. Guidance has been in business for 18 plus years and has been profitable since 2003. And we have implemented a lot of big name solutions, including Foot Locker, Ray-Ban, Oakley, and One Hope Wine. So Steve was talking about the critical trends in technology use, and some of the key areas that he pointed out were about the payment methods and fraud detection and shipping. So I'd like to address it from that perspective and give some examples, especially in the context of Magento platform. So with the multi-currency support, before we start implementing something as implementers or business owners, what we should start looking at is to establish the multi-currency account with the payment processor that you work with, or set up the multiple accounts with multiple payment processors. And then get into the implementation to support the multiple currencies. And here are some screenshots that were presented on the Magento Enterprise Edition platform. So from the admin user interface, logged in as the admin user, you start going to the systems and then select the configuration option to get to the next screen, and then you will see the currency setup. So there are several options there, and one of them is the currency setup. And that's where you can set up the base currency and then the additional currencies that the site or the store would allow to work with. Once this is set up, you would go into the currency setup. Here, what you're setting up is the web service X. This is the default import service for the currency exchanges that you're going to get. So the get call that you see there is pulled from the code, the configuration of the default web service that you will be using to pull the currency exchange rates, and you can also create the custom imports as necessary by customizing that module over there, Magento directory model currency import abstract. You have the option to schedule the currency imports as needed, and the schedule time and the frequency, etc., and the email error message addresses are also available for you to configure. In terms of the payment methods, the screen on the left shows what's available out of the box. And that's pretty much the default options that you have. But at the same time, you also see that once you get into the credit card configuration, you see most of the common credit cards here, but you have the ability to extend it or configure as necessary as well. Here's how you would configure or extend the module to support additional payment gateway and processors. The snippet of configuration is pulled from the config.xml file. And to extend this module, you go to the modules directory and extend one of the modules listed there. And then there are specific methods that you can implement or choose to implement as well. But do note that this is not an interface, so any operation will default to methods in this particular option. When it comes to shipping, the Magento platform comes out of the box with the multiple flat rates, table rates, etc. And again, you see the usual suspects here, such as UPS, USPS, FedEx, and DHL. And then you can create the multiple shipping support by first setting up the standard module and then use the config.xml to make the necessary changes. And then the carrier model actually can be extended by customizing the merge shipping model carrier abstract. So some of the related lines from the relevant lines from the configuration files are also mentioned here. Now, fraud is a big issue. There are several different third-party tools or third-party APIs that you can use to implement. But basically, if you look at it, the fraud detection and fraud prevention actually works at the multiple levels. So this is a generic approach that some of these custom modules would offer. First, you look at the AVS and CVM rules, and then as a second strategy, you can look at the international IP screening rules with the high sensitivity for the domestic sales. And then option C, you look at the international IP screenings with the sensitivity for the international sales set to lower. And then you set up the rules to hold an order prior to shipment for agent review of hard good orders. We have a case study to show this particular approach later. And then as an option, as a strategy E, you have the rules to accept or reject an order where there's no time for review that, especially with the digital goods. So what you do is you combine the rules to target the nature of the store, the nature of the goods. So what you typically do is combine A, B, and D for the domestic sites and hard goods, and A, C, and D for international store and hard goods, etc. So once the rules are set up, once the strategy has been taken place, the rules are automatically applied to all the orders. But out of the box, Magento offers payment. Sorry, this is a case study option. I don't have another slide for the out of the box. Basically, you work with the payment processor and leverage the fraud detection programs that they make available to you, and you can configure it that way. So to present a case study, we have a client that actually used the payment to authorize only option, and then orders are then placed in a custom status. Then the custom status orders are being reviewed by picked up by a cron and formatted for human feedback. And this is where somebody would actually review it. And here we're saying that somebody who would detect these fraud matrices, fraud patterns, would act accordingly and then put the order back into queue. And at that point, the order amount is verified, capture, and then the order sent to the processing status. But talking about the payment methods and shipping and fraud detection is not the end of the story. There is another aspect to this, which Steve also pointed out, which is the internationalization or localization of the entire site. This is a fairly key factor that helps determine the success of the entire solution internationally. So there ain't really no such thing as a plain text. So every single text that you display or every image that you display needs to be reflected to what region you're working with. And then the text itself has the character set that you need to work with. So the most common approach is to go with the UTF-8, which stands for the Unicode Transformation format. And MySQL that Magento uses supports this character set out of the box. The issues to consider: the type of the data that you're working with, what languages you need to support, what kind of data is it, and how wide the data is, etc. Because when you transfer or translate the data from one format to the other, one character code from the other, if you do not have enough width to support it in the database, you could get the data truncation, which you want to avoid. So the recommendation is to plan an upfront data analysis and do a lot of tests to go through that, and also to work with the the database model to prevent from the data being truncated. Another two key considerations that I like to mention, without going into the details, are the PCI compliance and the European Union's insistence on the privacy protection. The PCI compliance, both of those are really up for interpretation by individual businesses. And if you have the different divisions in other regions of the world, you want to work with the local authorities to ensure that the PCI compliance or any regulations on the customer protection, customer data protection, etc., are compliant. That's pretty much it for the technology, just briefly. I'd like to invite Steve to join me to take any questions that you may have. And someone else from Guidance is a key developer specializing on Magento. Jason Johnston, please join us. Thanks. Any questions so far?
Next question.
The PCI, as I understand it, is it's not just how the technology is used to implement the solution, but how the business is run as well. There are specific and very lengthy rules that you have to go through and verify. But start with what kind of data you're capturing from the credit card, from the user's data, and how you're storing it. And my recommendation is not to store it not to persist it in your database unless it is absolutely necessary. The best approach is to work with someone like Authorize.net or someone like PayPal, and then let them handle that, deal with the credit card data directly, and you just pass that on and use the token that you receive for further, for subsequent transactions. But again, the PCI compliance really goes beyond what data you're capturing. It's about the processes that you have in the, as a business, and who has access to what, and keeping the logs of those. Any additional comments, Steve?
Not for me.
Thank you. Well then, I think that's it. Thank you so much for your interest, and hopefully this session has been useful for you. Thank you.